We are here in Boston on May the 15th.
16th.
Or May 16th, 2017, with David Scudder. And David Scudder has a long-time association with the New England Conservatory. And David, if you would be so good as to tell us how far back your association goes and what roles you have served here at the Conservatory.
I started as a board member and as treasurer of the New England Conservatory in the summer of 1966. The reason I did that was there was a board member by the name of David Crockett who was a neighbor of mine in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and who knew me there and knew of my interest in music. And David and Sherwin Badger, who was then the chairman of the board, were desperate in a search for a treasurer. I had just turned 30. I knew nothing about how to be a treasurer, but I was entranced by the possibility of getting involved in music, which was something that I had always loved, but had remarkably little professional talent for. So I was an appreciator as opposed to a participant. But David and Sherwin, I remember, took me out for lunch somewhere and suggested that I would be a good treasurer. And since I didn't know any better, I accepted there. So I came on board in the summer of 1966, met Gunther right away, found out to my dismay that the accounting and bookkeeping systems at the conservatory were, let's put the word for rudimentary. And you couldn't get an idea as to what the budget was doing, whether it was in balance or not, until a month or two after the books had closed. It was very slow. It was done principally by hand. Remember, this was the day before massive computing power and things like that. And so there was a great deal of guesswork involved. Gunther, of course, as you know, had been hired to shake up the school. He shook up the school very effectively. A lot of older faculty were encouraged to move on, and a lot of new, younger, very exciting faculty were engaged by Gunther. And he engaged them at salaries, of course, that he worked out with them. He felt, in my opinion, that his charge was imperative to revitalize New England Conservatory, which, although it still had a fine reputation, also was viewed here in Boston and probably outside of Boston as being somewhat sleepy, a little bit somnolent in the early to mid 1960s, resting on its laurels perhaps a bit there. So the board decided to shake things up, and they did not know how effective they were going to be by appointing Gunther as the president. So my job as volunteer treasurer was to try to work with the bookkeeper/accountants, figure out what was going on with the numbers, there, tell Gunther and tell the board. And it was difficult. It was a real big challenge, but it didn't take all that long for me to find out that indeed the spending was going to be considerably greater than the revenue. Oh, so what to do, about it there. And I remember having to deliver this news to Gunther, and then he said, well, you better tell the board. So fine, we told the board, and the board kind of looked somewhat shocked. They probably shouldn't have been, because Gunther had to spend money in order to do his act of reinvigoration of the school. But they were. And I remember quite distinctly I think it was in about the first year, or certainly no later than the second year when I was involved as treasurer. So it would have been 1967 or 68, having to go to New York with Gunther and with Sherwin Badger, the chairman, and make a presentation to our most famous wealthy alumna, Mrs. Rockefeller, there. And I guess it worked because she and her advisors indeed did come up with a very considerable sum of money, which was the only way, quite frankly, at that point in time, we were really going to balance the books. That was not the first occasion that I worked with Gunther on trying to balance the books there. And it was a fascinating but rather wild ride from a financial standpoint. So we got the books balanced. Gunther hired more people, spent money on some programs and things like that, and by gosh, of course, then we were going to be out of balance again. So it was a classic high wire act from the financial standpoint. And more than once, I had to go with Gunther or with Sherwin Badger or with other members of the Board of Trustees to various prospective donors, foundations, and things like that, and make the case that we knew what we were doing from a financial standpoint, which I had to kind of cross my fingers when I said that, and give them some idea of what a budget was going to be. Well, somehow it worked, you know, and we got through there. And until the rather early 1970s, when we had a rather famous financial crisis, and the Boston Globe published this big insert in the magazine about how NEC was going to close its doors. Well, we worked that one out too.
And that was that the Ford Foundation that came to the rescue?
Ford Mellon. I think it was, I'm trying to remember now. That's a very good point. It was either Ford and Mellon, or it was one or the other, and I'm not absolutely clear on the details right now. But we did. We got the money. Right. We, in effect, quote unquote, saved the school from closure at that time. I found working with Gunther Schuller to be one of the most invigorating moments of my entire life. Absolutely fantastic from a standpoint of a person who was a genius, really, who had his thumbs and fingers in so many different pies that he hardly knew what he was doing, and yet he somehow did. He might wait till the last minute to try to do something, but he'd get it done. And it was really astonishing, and it was amazing to work with him, watch him, see him progress through a thinking process where he was very quick. He was remarkably quick. And he would grasp numbers. You know, he wasn't a trained economist, mathematician, or what have you, but he certainly grasped numbers quickly, understood them, had to deal with them, and we worked it out, you know, there. It was a remarkable period of time for the school, and I would not want to go through that sort of thing again, but it was astonishing, and I have still the most respect, I think, for Gunther of almost anybody I've met in the musical field because of what he could do and what he did do for the school.
He was a very forceful person, and he had very strong opinions about what was right and what was good.
Yes.
Often right and good come in conflict with the realities of numbers and finance.
Right.
What were the board meetings like? I mean, we're now at the place where we're remembering history. We're trying to put history down.
Yeah.
What would be the feeling in a board meeting when you would have to make the treasurer's report, read the balance sheet?
Yeah.
Were there factions that would say, look, we can't do this anymore. It's all great. You can do all you want to do, but you have to stay in budget. Were there other factions that said he should spend and we'll find the money? We gave him this mandate. What was the feeling like? That's the thing you can never get from a page.
Now, that's a very, very good question. I would say there were three primary factions. So the first was indeed the conservative faction. Hold our budget to the exact numbers. don't let any overspending come through, and if anything, cut back. And there were several people who were on that side of things. Then there was the second faction of, we've got to let him do what he needs to do. Then there was the third faction, which was kind of in between, who would listen to one, would listen to the other. And they were probably the largest faction of the three there. Normally, they would come down, or more than half of them would come down on the side, we've got to keep going. But there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth there. But the principal decisions, as I remember anyway at that time, we've got to keep going, but we've got to find the money, and how are we going to do that, and then try to execute on that. But there was a definite faction, which was a minority of the board, but not a small minority, that was considerably more conservative, considerably more scared about what was going on, and not happy at all with the finances that came out of the spending.
Did that faction also have a view of the pedagogy and the musical material and things that were being done as well? Or was it really just financial?
It was much more on the financial side. I think they trusted that people either on the board or in the administration, whether it's Gunther or other people there, would keep the pedagogy, the reputation of the school intact, but they didn't want to spend as much money in order to do so.
Yeah. Boston as a city in the 1960s and 70s was probably not in its boom period in any way. And so there was a great deal of what one usually refers to as old money, but maybe not even as much of that.
That's quite true too, because Boston was at that point in time a sleepy city. It was not what it is now at all, which is a very charged up city with enormous development and enormous excitement going on. Things were quite sleepy there. We didn't have what we have today, like a huge biotech industry. The only thing we really had in the 60s were a few high-tech companies such as Digital Equipment or Wang Laboratories, which started there. So we had some reputation as a city in high-tech. There wasn't a great deal else, though, because a lot of the older industries were mature, either had moved out of Boston, had merged, or were in decline. And not enough new stuff was coming in to take their place at that point in time. So yes, there was something going on there in the high-tech area, but there wasn't a great deal else there. Healthcare was not as big and as important as it is now. And so there was always a need to try to find money from both the older sources, which of course were being asked by every other institution of reputation in the city too, and trying to find it from newer sources, of whom there were not that many. We were able, as I remember, to get some representation from high tech. I do remember that, yes. I think we got at least a couple of board members who turned out to be very good board members too, and excellent there. And I think that's what any board, by the way, has to do. You've got to go out and try to find the new industries. You've got to find representatives from that to reinvigorate your board with some frequency. And we did that, I would say, moderately well, but we need more.
Would Gunther be at many of the board meetings, or was he busy? Okay. When he was there, what was his... because those of us who've worked with him musically know him as an irascible person at times, volcanic in personality, and so self-assured. What was it like when he would be hearing the debate about, when the factions were actually talking or whatever they did in discourse? How would his reaction? Was he reserved? Did he understand that this was This was not an orchestra to be dictated to, but a group of people who were working on his behalf. I mean, how did his demeanor and his thinking, and how was he strategic in board meetings? Did he have that sense of...
Yes, on that, he was quite good. He would go back and remind board members what he was hired for.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I have a vision. I'm doing this, there. He was very emphatic about that. So he did have a sense of longer-term strategy and how to make that happen there. It was hard for him sometimes to control his impatience at board meetings, and yet he kind of knew he had to. He had to let people speak. He had to, even if he quite disagreed with them, he had to, because he was not in charge of the board. He might have been in charge of the faculty, but certainly not the board there. So he learned that rather early on. And so he held himself in check, albeit with difficulty from time to time there. And of course, his force of personality came through. And a lot of the board members were quite in awe of him, but there were some who were less in awe and who did not hesitate to speak up there. But I would say the vast majority of board members were in awe of or highly respectful of him when he talked about his vision, when he talked about music education, when he talked about music in the country as a whole, very much in awe of him. The sharper questions would come about how are you implementing this and spending and all this sort of stuff like that there. So was there tension? Yes, but it didn't really erupt.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever feel that there could have been a way to channel it a little more, that there could have been a way for the dollars to have been focused differently and he could have still gotten what he wanted? And did you ever present him with that idea that it's not that you need to actually do less, but is there a different way of doing it? The reputation, for instance, that he'd go to Tanglewood in the summertime and he would see these fabulously talented young people and just say, show up in September. You're all set. Don't worry about the payment. That probably happened in hiring and in projects, that sort of thing, that sort of spontaneous enthusiasm. How did you ever want to approach him and say, we could do this, Gunther, but can you have a window that's a little longer or whatever you might do? Or did you really feel that, no, he needed to work at his pace and we support it?
I think more the latter, because he was so much more knowledgeable about what was happening in the music profession, so much more knowledgeable about the recognition of pure talent in the profession, whether it was a student or a faculty member or whoever, that we were somewhat in awe of him in that regard. We could not, any of us board members, challenge Gunther in that way whatsoever. We could make the point, and we did, okay, can you slow down here? Do you have to hire quite as many? Can you ease back a little bit? And there would be that dialogue. Yes.
What would his reaction? That's sort of what would he be like in those
He
moments?
would listen. He didn't particularly want to give in, but he would listen at least, very definitely, there. And he might give in a little bit here and there. He wouldn't compromise in any major way, but in little ways here and there. Yeah, I mean, he showed that he knew that he was stressing the finances of the school almost unbearably. And so he would give a little bit here and there and a little bit here and there, but principally he charged the board with going out and raising the money to support him.
When he would attend, you've mentioned that when you would go to the Rockefeller, the Ford, or the Carnegie Mellon Foundation, he would go with you.
Oh, yes.
And we know he's an extraordinarily articulate spokesperson.
Very.
Even though he was on the avant-garde of the musical scene, was that respected by those organizations? When
I think so. Yes. I never saw anything but respect for him as a leader in the musical scene.
Mm-hmm. Was we talk about Boston being sleepy, but the rest of the country was in a terrific GDP period there. I mean, there were an awful lot of very good things in the economy.
Well, the 60s were, the 70s were much tougher.
Right, I'm sure. By about 72 or 73.
72 or 3, things really began to get quite difficult because of far too high inflation, far too high interest rates, and the economy kind of collapsed for a while. 70s were a very tough decade.
Yeah.
60s were a pretty good decade.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally in the early 80s, we really began to move again. But the 70s were tough.
Your response just now about the 60s and 70s were financial. But for just a moment, to what degree was all of this an experiment reflective of the time? That you could go to the Ford and Rockefeller and they would hear an inspiration to revolutionize this and to see visionary to that. Was that replicable, or did Gunther and this institution come up with this at just the exact right time in history to try the experiment and run the experiment for 5 or 10 years?
It's a very good question because, of course, in the late 60s, the Ford Foundation particularly was trying to set a new course for U.S. foundations and trying to drag other major foundations along behind it. They were trying to be much more forward-looking than the older style foundation had been, and they were quite willing to look at somebody like Gunther as an example of being forward-looking there. So it was not difficult to go to somebody at Ford and persuade them, really, this is something you've got to back. And then if Ford did it, then it became easier, of course, to go to a somewhat more conservative foundation at that time was Mellon. But they came along too there, and they were very helpful to us several times, I remember. So there was an attitude led by Ford in the U.S. major foundations that we've got to, in effect, shake ourselves up a bit and do some things that are more forward-looking. And that was helpful, very helpful to us.
Was all the Rockefeller, did Nelson and David and everyone get involved in helping the conservatory, or was that sort of limited, or was it always through the foundation and separate from any of the personalities?
It was either through the foundation or Mrs. Abby Rockefeller, who was the alumna.
Right.
The others, I don't remember ever talking to other members of the family. Well, David Rockefeller Jr. was here in Boston then, and I saw him socially quite a bit and things like that, and he asked questions about it. He was very good on that, of course, being quite musical himself. But he didn't have the kind of sway over the family or the foundation that he has now.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of things. Gunther brought, in addition to his larger vision, there was this niche that he discovered, and that'd be ragtime. I mean, that's what I was going to say.
Ragtime and the third stream.
And the third stream, of course. But the first one I want to make, which is probably a smaller topic in a certain way, but on that conservative faction, the ragtime ensemble suddenly became a popular act.
Became a hit.
Yeah, a hit.
Absolutely,
right? In a culture much, much wider than the classical music culture. And again, is it serendipity? Max Morath, The Sting, Gunther Schuller all discover Scott Joplin at once.
All at once. Yes.
All at once.
Yeah.
How did the board feel about that? Was that that phenomena? I mean, did they perceive what it was doing for the conservatory's reputation and such? And was, for those who might have been conservative and maybe questioning Gunther on certain levels, did this sort of ease the steam?
Yeah, I think most board members really liked it. I mean, what's not to like with Scott Joplin? Really.
Right.
There. And he had been forgotten for so long. And then it got on, cover of Time magazine and everything else like that. So you know, you looked at that and said, oh my gosh, oh, well, this is becoming quite a big hit, and we're right in the middle of it. Well, isn't that kind of good? Mm-hmm. So I think most people quite appreciated that and liked it happening.
Mm-hmm. How did they, and now we can talk about Third Stream, you know, reflective of that 70s idea that we were going to look at all things anew, Mr. Lincoln encouraged us to do. Did the board find that to be an attractive thing, one of the attractive things about what Gunther was doing? Or was anyone on the board who might have been a music aficionado at all resistance because they thought that those higher fences were good for the various arts? I remember he started a jazz program. In fact, you would have financed it and watched the line items for that, a whole new chapter in the
completely new
books.
Well, I think starting the jazz program here was incredibly important. I mean, we were the first conservatory, first music school of any kind in the country to have a formal program in jazz. And I think, as I remember anyway, most of the board members really liked that. Mm-hmm. It is a unique American art form with great names associated with it that a lot of the board members knew and had listened to and tapped their feet to, and and stuff like that there. So I think the jazz thing, because jazz was viewed as sort of Louis Armstrong type jazz, it wasn't the more avant-garde really there. So I think that was quite accepted, and people realized this was forward-looking and interesting. Mm-hmm. Third Stream, I think a lot of people scratched their heads over. Mm-hmm. What is this third? How are you going to combine two things that are completely different? But on the other hand, that was quite a bit smaller in scope at the school than the jazz was. Mm-hmm. So people paid much more attention to the jazz. Mm-hmm.
And financially, the Third Stream, therefore, just because of size,
it wasn't that much of a challenge.
Right. So, well, that was probably, whether that was strategic or serendipitous.
Yes. But it probably was helpful, at least. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The story, I don't think it was apocryphal, that the pink slips had actually been handed out in 1970. You referenced the famous Boston Globe. That it had actually happened, that we had gotten to the place where we were having to tell faculty members that it might close. First of all, is that apocryphal? Was there a moment where you said to Gunther, we should probably not make ourselves liable. We should start letting people know that we might have to.
I certainly never said that.
Okay.
No.
Were pink slips handed out?
That I do not know for sure. That could be a rumor, and I don't really know. I don't have the facts on that. But I did warn people of the financial situation where we were. I warned Gunther, I warned the board. I wanted everybody to know that, and that we really had dug ourselves quite a hole, and from which we had to extricate ourselves by means of really some last-minute fundraising. Mm-hmm. And that was quite dangerous. It was the perils of Pauline sort of all over, but we managed to do it.
It's said around here that the original mandate for this school was, the founder said, expenses and tuition should match.
Yes.
As opposed to George Eastman or Mrs. Bach, who laid a foundation deep and wide, and allowed them to be healthier longer. When you inherited the books, were we still almost on that model?
Yeah. Unfortunately, as I remember in 1966, I think the size of our endowment fund was between $2 and $3 million.
Which is the equivalent of 15 million today?
Probably. I'm trying to think now what it might be, even 20 or something. But it was nothing compared with Juilliard or Eastman or Curtis at all. Unfortunately, past boards of trustees had, in my judgment, failed the institution by not going out and raising sufficient funds for permanent capital. Now, there wasn't a single big donor such as Mrs. Bach and Curtis, there. On the other hand, I don't know that anybody really tried. The one great big donor, of course, here was Eben Jordan, the son who financed Jordan Hall, but that was way back in the very early years of the 20th century. And I don't know of any other big single donor that came along after that. Whether the school really tried or not, I'm not clear. But if it tried, it didn't succeed. So we were stuck with a model that still was heavily tuition dependent, more so than our competition, yes.
When Gunther came, did he evidence to you any, because although you've acknowledged off camera that you were not part of the search process.
No.
And you really you wouldn't be able to share anything, any post-fact, post-facto reminiscences on your part about how that might have gone by or happened?
No, because I was not a part of it. I came on very shortly after Gunther was appointed in here, but I was not a part of the search process.
Did Gunther ever evidence to you or betray to you in private or semi-public that he thought that the institution was financially more capable of bringing about the transformations for which they had hired him? Or was he aware that there wasn't a lot of cash in the pot, but that's just the way it was, and that was the board's job to fix that?
I think it was more that. I think he was aware that there were not sufficient financial resources to support his vision. I don't think he was aware, because I don't think anybody was there, that in order to support his vision, in terms of the faculty appointments, et cetera, and things like that, that the gap would become as wide as it was. And he didn't know that, of course, but he went out and he said, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to hire that person, I've got to do that there. And suddenly then the bill had to be paid. And he knew that there was going to be a deficit, but nobody knew, either he or the board, how big it was going to be. He knew, and he always reminded the board that he was hired to shake things up and make it a much better and much more contemporary and much more alive School of Music Education, which he did there. And no one, I think it's fair to say, whether it was Gunther or the board members, really knew how much this might cost.
Do you think that you're referring to it sort of as a sleepy institution? When Gunther came, did the city respond? I mean, did he create an excitement in the musical world?
I think so.
Because, let's see, the orchestra across the street would have had Leinsdorf, I think, at that point, or Steinberg.
And I don't know when they first would have played a work of Gunther at the BSO. We could check that out, but I would assume maybe back in the 70s. But the symphony certainly knew of Gunther very well, and the orchestra knew of him, respected him greatly.
But did the regional reverberation happen as the board had hoped? I mean, sometimes a prophet is less known or recognized in their own land. In the New York people might have been really interested in what Gunther was doing. Did the city respond in a way that the board, to some degree, that the board had hoped it would respond to Gunther?
Well, that's a good question, because Boston at that time was such a conservative city. And a few people responded well, but I don't think the city as a whole embraced Gunther as quickly or as completely as the board would have liked, or as Gunther would have liked. There. It came later, but it was not a quick or an easy process.
Gunther finally, 1974, decided that it was time
to go.
To go other places. What were your first of all, what might have been his motivation? Did he betray to you? His motivation for it? Did he give you a laundry list of the things, David, I just XXXX?
Well, he said to me, I've been here, or I will have been here now 10 years. Mm-hmm. I think he really had it in mind when he first came here that 10 years might be it. Mm-hmm. And that would be enough. He never said it openly, but he did refer to the 10-year period a number of times. Mm-hmm. So I suspect that even when he first took the job on, he may have had in the back of his mind, I'll do this for 10 years and see what happens, but then I've got so many other things to do.
Exactly. Do you feel like when he left, did he feel that he had done the work or that he had started the work of the vision? Do you feel like he, how do you think he felt?
I don't think he would have ever felt that he completed.
Well, yes, all right.
His work. I think he felt he had made a very good start. But if he had stayed here for another 10 years, he would have worked like the devil to advance the school in other ways. I don't know what.
Right.
But he was never a person to be fully satisfied. It's exciting to work with somebody who has a big vision, knows that it's going to be hard to accomplish, but is working constantly on it, but it's never satisfied. And that was God. He was never satisfied, really. He said, "We made progress here. We've done better here. We've hired some good people there. But now we've got to go here. We've got to do this there." And that made him a very exciting person, of course, to work with.
Sure. How did the board feel? Were they ready to get off the roller coaster, or was there one of those panic moments where we've been taken, we're out here on Outward Bound now, and the tour guide's gonna, go back to civilization. Yeah. And we've got to figure it out. How do you think the board felt?
I think the board felt, it's probably time to now consolidate what Gunther has done. Very often in institutions, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit for that matter, there's an exciting person who comes in and does a huge amount in a fairly short period of time, and then you have to step back and you try to consolidate and make sure that you don't lose that, but that you take a few deep breaths and try to reassess where you are and kind of rethink things out there. And I think the board, frankly, was probably ready at that point to enter into more of a consolidation phase.
I was at a dinner at one point with Gunther and two colleagues who had been here with him from the beginning, and it was revealed in the middle of that dinner that they had never spent a meal together outside even at the conservatory. Their relationship, which was deep and long, was exclusively musically oriented in the building, which made me think about something I'd like to ask you. Did Gunther and Margie, and I would like to get your
Margie's
feelings.
wonderful.
Now we can bring Margie into the conversation, and we should.
Yes.
Were Gunther and Margie social? He was so busy doing the job, but were they out and were they social with members of the board and the extended activities? You go to the MFA reception, not just your own reception, because that puts you in contact with the larger world in Boston. Did Gunther do that? Did Margie do that? And what were they like as they navigated those waters of what had been probably heretofore into the 60s, a fairly closed, the Boston society fairly closed.
That's right.
How did they, here they are New Yorkers,
and
a Midwesterner. How did this all,
well, first of all, I really loved Margie. She was a terrific woman and an amazing amount of support for Gunther. Gunther was not the most organized person. Margie was very organized and very good, and she could calm him down like nobody else could. Like absolutely nobody else could there. And at the same time, of course, she had the two boys to raise there. But she was a wonder. And if you ever went to their house then, she was the calming influence and you would step in there, and if Margie was there with Gunther was calmer around her. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. He relied on her incredibly to give him, in a sense, sustenance, to almost force him, perhaps, from time to time, to draw back from his activities and just think a little bit, to relax just a little bit here and there. And she was remarkably good at that. She created a wonderful environment in that house for him. And so she was a terrific asset there. But did Gunther have much time, given all the things he was doing? He was writing music, he was conducting, he was the president of the conservatory. He did not have much time for socializing. He did not have much time for going out and shaking hands gladly with a whole lot of other people. That really wasn't part of his life, because he would prefer to sit down there and spend 5 hours writing music or thinking about an orchestral rehearsal coming up and correcting a score or something like that. I remember once, though, being in his house, this is a long time ago then, and he just showed me what he could do musically, because he put on a jazz record on the turntable. That was when we still had turntables and things like that there. And he listened to it, I think no more than about once, took out his music staff and wrote all the notes right out. All there. And I was absolutely astonished that anybody had those ears to be able to pick out each and every single line of improvisation and just write it out. Well, it was remarkable. But because he had that gift and he had that interest, he really did not have a lot of time for what you'd say are the sort of necessary duties of a president, to glad hand people, to really get the donors engaged and stuff like that. He did some of it, but he didn't do a lot.
Okay, so there wasn't a lot of social. Yeah. Tell me, what do you think? What do you think was the great legacy of Gunther at the school?
Oh, that the school was brought really right up to challenge the other best musical schools in the country from a standpoint of imagination, a standpoint of being flexible, a standpoint of looking forward into the future. We couldn't challenge them financially. They all had bigger resources, but we could challenge them intellectually a bit, that way, and we were flexible. And so the whole idea of being able to do a lot with less resources than other schools had kind of became part of the culture. And the board sort of accepted, all right, we've got to keep trying to do a lot. Yes, we don't have the same resources, but let's see what we can do there. I think that really changed. And I think Gunther really was responsible for that kind of a change in attitude.
Sure. Our colleague Andrew here actually worked for Gunther for a number of years in the publishing business.
Oh, yes.
So he has more of a role here than the
technical very
role
good.
He has.
Okay.
So I always ask him at this point about any questions that you think, Andrew, we should ask. Is there anything that you can think of that we might ask?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Gunther once told me that you were the backbone of sort of everything, that you made it all work for you.
Well, I feel flattered, but I really did try, very hard, because I really believed in what he was doing. And I worked at it, Yeah,
he appreciated it. And he told me that many years later.
So.
Actually, my wife, Susan Calkins, who did her doctoral dissertation on Gunther starting the jazz program, she asked me last night, she said, I went through all those executive committee minutes.
Oh, yes.
For the whole time that Gunther was there to try and piece together how it happened. But she was never sure exactly what the executive committee was. Was it a subsection of the...
It was a subcommittee of the board because the board was large enough, would meet, try to remember, maybe 4 times a year or 5 or something like that. And indeed, it had to do the crucial job of approving the budget and various other things like that. But in between times, you had to have a much smaller group that could meet and be flexible enough to meet on short notice and work with Gunther, work with the chairman on all sorts of issues that suddenly would come up.
There was a question that came to mind, and I don't want to leave it because it's an insight. Harvey Phillips, of course, is the shadow man in all of this, in the history.
Yes.
And how did Gunther work with Harvey, and how did Harvey work with you? And was it sort of a triumvirate, the 3 of you making this all work? Or how did you view that relationship?
Harvey was a great, great person. Not only, obviously, a fabulous tuba player, but a truly great person. And he, along with Margie, could calm Gunther down. Probably better than anybody else other than Margie that I could see, really, to do that. So he was a bit of the yin and the yang, with Gunther being quite volatile and Harvey not being volatile there. And I thought the 2 of them got along incredibly well, worked very, very well as a team. I loved dealing with Harvey. Again, like he shared with Gunther one thing, they both had very quick minds. They were very fast to grasp onto concepts or ideas or things like that. You didn't have to spend much time with them. Snap, they were there. And so they were a terrific pair of people to work with that way. And I was awfully sorry then Harvey left, but after all, I guess was the only endowed tuba chair in the country in Indiana, so he could hardly turn it down there. But he was just a wonder.
He was.
He really was.
What was the angriest you ever saw Gunther Schuller, and how did he express it?
Oh, well, it's funny. I'm.
Or were there a number of?
There were a number of things, but I'm going to tell you one story. So I was the only person who was a close friend of both John Updike, the author, and Gunther Schuller. John, because I lived in Ipswich, and John lived there too. And I knew him and his wife very well there. The idea came from, I think it was a woman's group, maybe at the Conservatory, I've forgotten now, that John Updike and Gunther Schuller should write an opera. And so I was engaged to introduce the 2 of them, which I did there. And the outcome was the children's opera, The Fisherman and His Wife, which was just revived here last year for the first time since it was initially done there. 2 people less alike in working habits I could not imagine than John Updike and Gunther Schuller. Both geniuses. John, extraordinarily disciplined, very organized, goes to his writing studio exactly about at the same time every day, sits down, writes his 500 words or whatever it is every single day. He did this his entire life there. That was his way of working. Gunther's way of working was to wait until almost the last possible moment, stay up till 4 a.m. and finish the job. John did not like that because he would write these things and he wanted the input from Gunther and the music in order to keep the progress going.
Next moment, right?
So there were a number of occasions where the 2 of them, though they had great respect for each other's genius, just didn't get along. And Gunther got mad at John, and John got mad at Gunther. They tried to be as gentlemanly about it as possible, but there was a lot of stress in that scene there, because the personalities of the two of them were quite different, and the working habits were quite different. In the end, I think it was a fascinating work, and certainly deserved to be brought back on the scene last year, and I enjoyed hearing it again for the first time in several decades there. But that was one occasion where I could clearly see he got very edgy.
How would when he was angry, was he volcanic and then it would be over? Was he a slow burn in these? Because in rehearsals, he's not a slow burn.
No,
he's very quick. Is he the same way when he was dealing with the non-musical issues?
He could snap something out very quickly,
right?
But then it would be over. He was not a person to, as I remember anyway, nurse grudges or things like that. But if he got mad, he would snap, and you know it. But that was quick and done and over, and I sort of got used to that. Yeah.
On the just to show that I'm not trying to, we're trying to stilt the conversation to the negative.
Yeah.
What was the most happy or joyous, relieved, positive that you ever saw Gunther? Was there a moment when you thought he thought the stars had aligned perfectly and the world was exactly where he would like it to be for that moment because of some?
Well, you go back to the ragtime. I don't remember Gunther being any happier that when that ragtime was really going full speed ahead and was the hit of the country, basically. He was beaming. And it was he that kind of brought this out and everything that there. He loved that, absolutely loved it. He loved Scott Joplin's music. He took some pride, as he should have, in the rediscovery of Scott Joplin there. And I remember him being bathed in smiles, and when he would come out of a rehearsal, let's say, of the ragtime group. I'm not sure I ever saw him happier.
Did
the time
you
he
feel
was,
like go ahead?
Yeah, no, the time he was saddest was obviously Margie's death. That was so devastating. Oh, so tragic. Far, far too early, far too young a person there. I felt after that he was not quite the same person. He didn't have quite the same sense of joy there. There was always that sort of deep sense of loss a bit there that I don't think he ever 100% got over that.
Well, he expressed to all of us that knew him that he only suffered writer's block when Margie died.
Yeah.
That was the only time when he didn't feel it, and then it came pouring forth, and he won the Pulitzer of the Peace.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've ever even told Andrew this, but I saw him a couple of days before his death.
Oh.
And we were pretty close by the end. And he said to me, he said, the other day I wrote a few notes of music, but he said, I woke up this morning and I thought, I think I've written all the notes I need to write.
Oh.
And of course, Kirsten and I looked at one another and thought, oh my, yeah. That has to be the valedictory statement.
Of course.
But I actually want to ask you, maybe this could be the final question. Did Gunther, because your relationship with him wasn't musically professional, it was professional in another way, did he ever betray to you a feeling that he thought that he was recognized appropriately by the larger musical world? Or was he one of those people who, whether accurately or not, perceived that there should be more recognition of what he was trying to do, or as a musician? Or did it never become part of anything that he said or did? I don't think he ever, to the best of my knowledge, said it in anything like quite that way.
But I do know that he was so happy and so pleased when he got recognition about the ragtime. I do know that he was certainly happy when the BSO would play a piece of his. I do know that he was certainly very happy when he would be invited to conduct a good orchestra, you know. I sensed, and this is just me speaking, I've never heard him say this,
Right.
that he really felt his talents were so large and so broad in the musical world that he should have been given a little greater recognition than he actually was.
Yeah. Anything else, Andrew, that you can think?
No, I don't think so.
We have been here in Boston, Massachusetts at the New England Conservatory on May the 16th, 2017, speaking with David Scudder, longtime member of the Board of Trustees, treasurer, and colleague of Gunther Schuller. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you both very, very much. It is a great pleasure to remember and to speak of Gunther.